Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so welcome to this first live event in the webinar Crisis Education, Critical Education, a toolkit for connected learning. I'm here with our first two guests for Module 1, which we've called Mapping the Field and Current State of Affairs, Needs and Necessities. And this webinar was initially initiated by Nishant Shah as part of his professorship in Aesthetics and Cultures of Technology at Artes University. But it really comes out of a field-wide realization in this moment that a focus on technological infrastructure and going online isn't really enough to produce meaningful education anymore. So this webinar really comes out of this sort of anxiety that if we focus too much on the digital space or these rectangles that we're all sort of increasingly getting stuck in over the last months of COVID-19, we're going to end up reducing education to something that we might not be all that satisfied with. And we want to try and start a dialogue about how we understand this shift and, more importantly, how to gather a toolkit that sketches out the possibilities we have in possibly doing things differently. And to help us kickstart this conversation and help us understand this shift, we're really pleased to introduce the two guests for this first module, Seda Gürses and Florian Cramer, who both made what I think are super urgent points in their videos, which you can also find in the link below the description, where we're mapping out what is at stake in this current moment. And also we'll be monitoring the chat that you see to your right of this window. So if anybody viewing out there would like to ask a question to our two guests, then please do so. But first, I want to give a short introduction of both of our guests. Florian Cramer is a reader in 21st century visual culture at Willem de Kooning Academy in Rotterdam. He specializes in the autonomous practices with a focus on DIY artist-run initiatives and self-organization as contemporary art. He's also an active and integral part of the Rotterdam art and design scene and is on the board of various different art spaces, such as the Player, Print Room, and Mono in Rotterdam. And Seda Gürses is currently an associate professor in the Department of Multi-Actor Systems at TU Delft at the Faculty of Technology and Policy Management, and an affiliate at the COSIC group at the Department of Electrical Engineering in KU Leuven in Belgium. And her work focuses on the privacy enhancing and protective optimization technologies, privacy engineering, as well as questions around software infrastructures, social justice, and political economy as they intersect with computer science. And finally, I would like to introduce myself as I'll be moderating this discussion. My name is Sissel Marie Tong. I'm a visual artist and arts organizer based in The Hague, but I'm originally from Denmark. I work primarily with tactile and interactive installations, which has, of course, also proven rather difficult in this current situation. So I'll be coming more from the sort of arts practitioner point of view. I also occasionally do teach at art academies, and I'm a co-founder of the artist initiative, The Reading Room, which is a nomadic series that focuses on the practices of reading and studying together in a non-institutional setting. So that being said, I was thinking that we could perhaps start by going through some of the main threads, connecting both of your videos and try to synthesize them together and think about what kind of tools and methods we might be able to assemble together that possibly will help people in same situations in the field. And I think from both of your videos, we're reminded that people, students, university teachers, staff, all had to move really quickly to put their work and their teaching online and their learning online, which has created what Seda in her video calls the getting things done moments, which can also be considered sneaky moments, which I think is a really wonderful term that we can use to think with. And these sneaky moments is where small decisions that were made is likely going to have a bigger impact down the line. So, of course, one of the main things we've seen has been this mass migration to proprietary platforms such as Zoom and Teams and Skype, which we're now on, which, as Seda reminds us, was not built for educational purposes. In fact, there is a financial interest behind these technological companies, and perhaps even from universities themselves along the line, to keep education on online platforms, even as possible lockdowns are lifted. And we're also confronted, of course, with perhaps hidden privileges when we ask students and even teachers to conform to this possibly new normal. For instance, with these current technological setups, we're assuming that everyone has a good internet connection, that everybody has good equipment, data, a quiet, safe place to study at home or work from home, of course. And of course, with Florian's talk, we see a real danger of some aspects of art education being made increasingly inaccessible, and that there are certain forms of teaching that is just easier done online, so perhaps would be favored. So there might be, like a favoring or a predominance of lectures and tutorials, whereas working with material and engaging with the physical space that artists and designers often do will be put in the background. That also means workshops and general spaces of the academy or of the university is suddenly inaccessible, as well as the people who were taking care of those places. And Florian, you also talk about the danger of using sort of outdated modes of talking about materiality versus immateriality, analog versus digital, which is binaries that we in the field have sort of been spending a lot of energy throughout the years nuancing. And with that being said, I've wanted to start the discussion trying to frame what I see as sort of an institutional viewpoint, perhaps, or focusing on institutional frameworks in Seda's video versus possible ways that practitioners can work around this current situation of being stuck in rectangles and the power grabbing moments that might be happening as we're doing this. So going back to this question of sneaky moments, could we think of that as a kind of counter tactic for practitioners, for people who are stuck in the rectangles, the students, the teachers, and how can we see it as an opportunity to feel ownership of the institution, possibly as a place of solidarity? And who are we in solidarity with? Who do we need to remember when we're zooming in on these sneaky moments? So I'm curious.
Florian, you want to try to? Yeah.
It was a question for you because the notion of sneaky moments is actually, that's your concept.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure whether I have a good answer. I mean, yes. I mean, in a way, you can say sneaky moments indeed come from both sides, right? They come from the institutions as a kind of power grabbing move, and we now have this also in the Netherlands. This talking about the new normal, which goes back to a common Dutch saying, "Doe normaal, je bent al gek genoeg." Yeah. So just behave normally because you're already crazy enough, which is like this kind of Calvinist moderation law, unwritten rule, consensus law in the Netherlands. So it means we are now getting something like a new unwritten law or a new unwritten consensus, and a consensus that is actually not discussed. So the pure act that we are here and actually discussing this is already a break with this kind of sneaky moment or this newly established consensus. But a sneaky moment, of course, can also be when, for example, as an artist, you try to establish a different protocol, or you break a protocol, or you create your own system. And what I try to do in my own lecture is actually point out that, let's say, the idea of remote and network collaboration was not invented by Silicon Valley, but was actually invented by artists from the 60s, 70s, 80s in countercultural practices. And it's kind of weird if we give this terrain, let's say, to these kind of corporate business meeting solutions, while we have 50 years of artistic practice of remote collaboration that works in very different ways. than this. But so that could be a sneaky moment as well. You could say, for example, the establishment of something like Riot Girl zines in the 1990s was a sneaky moment that broke with all the kind of established hierarchies and systems in the so-called creative industries, the music industry or the publishing industry when it was about zine making, etc., etc. And also that's also something, let's say, maybe something we as art schools have a difficulty with this, because art schools, let's say, normally come from more established institutional or commercial practices in art and design. So it's often, it's not that art schools are necessarily the laboratories where these kind of new experimental art practices are being developed, but it's the norm is more that art schools need to catch up with, what has been experimental 20 years ago. So that's another point. Let's say that this kind of alternative history of remote collaboration in the arts is not necessarily a history that is naturally known or present in art school education.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it's helpful to give a bit of a background to the sneaky moment as a concept. It's actually from discussions with Miriam Arak and Femke Snelting and Hara Roja. We became the Darmstadt delegation for a while, and we wrote the piece together, Let's First Get Things Done. And it was a response to, at the time, the Snowden revelations about the surveillance programs of the NSA and the Five Eyes. And it was shortly after the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, where a lot of movements had gone online and had mobilized towards revolutionary movement, and then maybe we're in the process of a counter-revolution where people were all of a sudden being prosecuted for participating in the large-scale protests in Middle East and North Africa. And the way we defined sneaky moment was this crazy moment where hierarchies get reconfirmed, right? And at the time, we were looking at how there were activists who were responding to the surveillance news about the mass surveillance programs that the USA had installed with these other partner countries, intelligence agencies. And they said, what we see here is that you can do targeted surveillance, but mass surveillance is not okay, right? And they said, it's okay if you have to go after terrorists. It's okay if you have to go after criminals, that you target them. But the fact that you've been doing broad sweeping mass surveillance is the problem, right? And so they started coming up, activists, digital rights activists especially, started coming up with technologies that people could use to protect their privacy vis-a-vis this surveillance government or collaboration among governments. And so they set up a situation where they said it's okay to do targeted surveillance, which actually was very much historically aligned with the fact of the war on terror, which had been targeting predominantly certain countries, and also a historical prosecution of activists, especially of activists of color and African-American activists in the case of the US, right? And so without maybe meaning to, they created this idea that if you have nothing to hide, you should be not under surveillance, but aligning themselves with a historical prosecution of people of color, either around the globe under the term of war on terror, or in the case of privacy against activists who've been working towards racial justice and against white supremacy. So it's that kind of sneaky moment where you think you're doing the right thing, right? Like you're saying privacy is the right thing, but in fact, like something is really off, and it's sneaky because it looks right? Like when Snowden came out, we were like, we got to do privacy, we got to have encryption. A lot of us installed Signal, Apple, and Facebook started encrypting their apps, and we were like, that's awesome, right? But what was underlying that was that it's okay to target brown and black people. It's just don't watch the white masses. If you see that message and the sneakiness of it, that's what the term was referring to. And I think we saw a lot of that in the last weeks as well, when the lockdown was very much measured across an imagined nuclear family that would stay together. Now, as they're like loosening they said you could go out in twos or as a family, and that was kind of seen as a four, right? Like, and I guess like the imagination is the two parent figures. I don't know if it was heteronormative and they have two kids because that's like the perfect number, right? Like, and it was really totally like breaking into a whole notion of collective living and other forms of togetherness, right? And those are the sneakiness of the sneaky moments, right? And the question is, how can we push back like just as fast and maybe become other forms of family? And yes, I think there's a lot of possibility for resistance, as Florian also suggested.
Mm. And I also think it's not necessarily a question, let's say, of proprietary or corporate versus free and open. I mean, that's the same thing that you, Seda, also mentioned with let's say, the sneakiness of choosing for activist solutions. Because, for example, instead of now talking in Skype, we could also have talked in Jitsi, which is an open source community-run service. But actually, Jitsi is just the same thing. It is okay. It is not corporately owned. There is not the same problem with data ownership that we have with Skype. But let's say the paradigm of the communication is pretty much the same thing. Namely, we are talking in these rectangles. You disagree, Seda?
I
saw
disagree.
you. Yeah. Why do you disagree? Why do you think Jitsi is better than Skype?
I mean, the question is like, what is your definition of better, right? Like, I mean, that's and I think that it's a huge thing to plug in the finances of your institution into the computational infrastructures, which suck it into a cloud infrastructure that is also living off of our energy grid, right? Like there's a whole set of relationships that you bank into, which is so different from the Jitsi rectangles. And that's why I said we need to peel the rectangles and look what's behind them. And I think there's a big difference when the Linux users group, says, I'm going to give the service, for free, and takes on the costs and commits to building local infrastructure that can be used by users and activists and communities in the Netherlands, versus I'm going to push my money into licenses. And the moment I stop paying for those licenses, I have nothing left. Nothing, right?
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference. That's it's a commitment of the finances of the institution. It's a commitment to a global capital infrastructure. It's totally different.
Okay.
Sorry.
Why do I disagree? Okay, now we have a debate. Well, first of all, even something like Jitsi is running on the same power grid, and is burning the same resources. And often peer-to-peer infrastructures are not more efficient, but rather less energy efficient than centralized. So, but for me, the point, and that's of course my art school perspective, is also an aesthetical one, right? I mean, it's almost a kind of rehash of the debate that we had about, let's say, community-run media in the 70s, 80s, prior to the internet. So the question is, it's like the question again: who owns the radio station, or who owns the TV station? Yeah, and do we have community-built radio and community-built TV with our own technology, maybe alternative technology, not with the big TV towers, run by small communities? But, and here comes the art school perspective, that's all nice and fine. And of course, we have to talk about infrastructure. We have to talk about, the technological governance and the politics in the technological infrastructure. I totally disagree. But if you end up just producing a conventional TV program or radio program that is not different from the kind of standard programs that we already have, or just gradually different, or I would also compare it, maybe provoke a few people. Nowadays, if you go into an art house movie theater, what you see is actually the same shit as the Hollywood. It's the same story. It's the same 5 acts story. It's only told, you don't have people in spandex suits, but you have like bourgeois families having their kind of bourgeois conflicts, but it's essentially the same. So for me, the question is not only ownership and politics of the infrastructure, but also what do we do with it? Do we use it to make experimental radio or experimental TV? Do we use it to make video art experiments, or do we do it for talk shows? And that's for me the problem. So Jitsi for me is, let's say, it's the community-run TV talk show. So it is still, let's say, 50% is missing for me. And this, by the way, it's also generally a problem with open source when it just has kind of rehashed the Microsoft and Apple paradigms, for example, in desktop computing, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that it's also about a different imagination of what this media and what this collaboration can be.
I think it really, yeah, go ahead, Sissel.
I was curious, Florian, if you could completely get your way, for instance, at the Willem de Kooning Academy and start over. It's a lockdown, but we don't have to scramble to get something online. We can start from scratch and maybe bring in people who are already working on their own media platforms and things like that. And you were talking in your video about forging new collaborations, for instance, with people in the art field. What would that look like? What would this ideal situation look like, kind of practically?
Yeah, I mean, for example, we now have community-run infrastructures for example, food support, right? Why isn't this something where we as an art school could interface with, where we could say this becomes part of what we study and also what we practice? Can you also think of, for example, support networks that now exist in the city, in the neighborhood, where people take care of each other? These are also communicative infrastructures. I also mentioned this one artist project in Rotterdam, which works with a kind of dead drop physical mail system. You know, why are we jumping into the online squares, and why don't we talk about, for example, these infrastructures also as possible collaboration structures that we could use as an art school to collaborate in a different way than in the classroom or in the studio, or how we or via the online conference. And I think we will be getting there. It's just, let's say, no, it's a classical moment where you know, maybe the critical imagination and also the artistic imagination is still trying to kind of get the pieces together. Yeah?
Yes,
what I also see with many colleagues and students, they are still in a shock situation. I mean, it's not, you know, we're not machines, and people cannot immediately come up, let's say, with the next solution when they're pressured in the situation. That's completely understandable. But it's a work that needs to be done, certainly. So, because otherwise it's really a kind of power grab again of yeah, you could say, of management mentality, because that's what it is. We're now basically turning art schools into business meetings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Seda, I was cutting across. You wanted to mention also something?
No, it's okay. Like, if you have, we can move on. That's good.
But then in that sense, Seda, you were also mentioning some non-institutional platforms and initiatives that you found to be possible collaborators as well, maybe to the university, or maybe not even to the university. Specifically, you were mentioning Constant in Brussels and Baria, which I think are based in Rotterdam. How would you see a kind of new collaboration being forged between sort of like larger institutions and perhaps smaller initiatives, if we're to ditch Zoom and Teams and think of a new way of communicating across time and space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many. I mean, I have so many questions about what's going to happen next, right? Like, I think in my presentation, like in the video, I said I don't know about the future of the university. So I don't know if we will have such things as students and professors in 6 months or 1 year or 2 years, right? And I also don't know how the priorities or the urgencies of our societies are going to change. So how do we even come to send out feelers for the kind of society that we're becoming, and to redefine the role of, for example, an artist and, for example, an academic, as not just knowledge producers or not just as people who are engaging aesthetics from different perspectives, but as doing so with the kind of new configuration of society, and in the process becoming something else, right? Mm-hmm. And I see this because I think one of the things we do see is that we're being subject to these kind of dichotomies that either we use these tools or there's nothing, right? Like, and I think multiplying that possibility and saying it's not this dichotomy, right? Like just like we did after Snowden, it's not about mass or targeted surveillance, but now, you know, it's not just about either Zoom or no university or no art school, right? Like, and to be able to multiply, I think we need to think about other formats, and I think that's why I really like the examples that Florian was giving in terms of like things that are not rectangles, but also to not deny our relationship to technology, but to come up with, let's say, kind of, you know, thinking about what are new ways of being with technology as well, right? Like, and how do we shape that? And I have to say, like, what combines all of these things, so the Darmstadt delegation, Constant, and Varia is a sort of new institutional, we call it the Institute for Technology and the Public Interest. And we've established it together with Femke and Femke Snelting, Helen Pritchard, Miriam Aurak, and myself right now, but hoping to expand, which is exactly about, like, can we develop new methods to engage the new we, right? Like the new public, right? What is this new public? What are its interests? And how, given our skill sets and resources, can we come to serve this? Instead of saying, you know, how do we continue the university, which I think is also an important question, but maybe a losing one, to already start preparing this new institution that is going to respond to these new urgencies.
And maybe also I need to nuance my own argument, because it sounds like I make a kind of pledge for going non-digital in our collaboration. That's not what I mean, because it just jumped into my head that one of the systems that people at Wunde Koning are really enjoying using, both students and teachers, are pads. I mean, although they're non-visual, everyone loves them because they give you the kind of non-managerial approach of collaboration, organic collaboration that teleconferencing systems don't give you.
Can you explain what the pad is? Just if they're
a pad is a super simple web page where you can just collaboratively write. I mean, for those many people are probably familiar with Google Docs. Imagine it's like Google Docs without a login, and anyone can just write on it. And it's even simpler because there's less formatting, so it's like trimmed down, very low tech. And everyone who contributes, who writes, has a different color, so you can also see what the different layers of contributions are. And you can set it up within a second. You just give people the addresses and then can start writing on it. And this is something, I see. But I see also a conflict there, because I see that school managements are getting nervous about the pads, because of privacy reasons, and because they're public, etc., etc.
They can also be bombed.
Of course, they can be bombed. Yeah, but the thing is, you can also roll them back. So if somebody spams a pad, you can just go back to an older version of the edit. But this is a typical example where also, Seda, what you say. Is that what we will have in the future? Will it still be the university, or will it be something else? Will it be a new institution that we're currently building, where these kind of seemingly small or banal questions are really crucial, I think. Because, sorry, if I make a historical footnote, actually, in my past, I was in comparative literature. I was a university philologist, and I wrote my PhD actually mostly about the 17th century. And in the 17th century, we had exactly the same movement, because most of the universities in the 17th century were still teaching scholastic medieval science. And let's say all the kind of new science and new philosophy, everything that started with Newton and Descartes and others, did not actually happen in the universities in the 17th century, but in self-organized academies. So even something like the Royal Academy in the UK was originally founded. It was called the Invisible College. That was the original name in that time, as a kind of self-organization, almost like an underground organization of scholars who did not fit into the hierarchies, bureaucracies, and also into the doctrines of the still medieval university systems. And you had that all over Europe, in all countries. So this could be, and historians call it the academy movement versus the universities, and something like this, already has been in the making. I mean, we have had alternative academies. Sissel, are you from Copenhagen by any chance? Are you familiar with the Copenhagen Free University by, among others, Jacob Jacobsen and others? I mean, this is a really good example of an initiative that has been, that has been a
film school,
has been around for 20 years or longer. Or also here in the Netherlands, we had the Free International University, originally founded by Joseph Beuys, but it also had a branch in Amsterdam. And then in The Hague, we had since the 70s, from the 70s to the early 2000s, the Vrije Academie, so the Free Academy, which was also an artist-run, non-degree, very free, but very interesting, great artists who came out of that academy, by the way. So maybe we are at a similar breaking point. But I also see the dystopia, by the way. But maybe I shut up because I'm talking too much, but later I can also tell you what I think could be the dystopia resulting from the current situation.
But so we could possibly see, if we're going to think of making sort of like a toolbox out of our experiences building this webinar, we could think of looking at non-institutional settings, both in history and also in the current moment, and look at, well, how did people do that? Like, how do we still keep on learning outside of the universities? But also, I feel like there is just a much more fluid crossover between non-institutional and institutional learning, which we in the reading room benefit from, of course, all the time, because we're getting funding from the Gemeente Den Haag or Stimuleringsfonds or independent art spaces, but often academics that we're inviting cuts us a deal because they have stable jobs, and then we can continue our program. So it is, I think, that there's not such a stringent divide between the two. I also wanted to possibly bring in this this term of context collapse, which you were sort of both pointing to, but happening in different domains. So, for instance, there is the context collapse of conducting education on business management platforms. You also both discussing the possible use of gaming platforms, but with different perspectives. And even this potential context collapse of using the mail postal system for making art that Florian brings up. And I'm also wondering, how can this context collapse? Can we sort of digest a little bit what this means, and sort of like, how can we think of it? How can it be used as a tool, and where should we really be aware of the dangers?
I guess now you're looking at me, Florian, like go.
No.
Okay.
It's like,
I mean, I think I'm really curious because it's one of the last things you say, right, Florian, in your video, saying you can use gaming platforms, like, right? Yeah. And it's very funny because I think I went on this like complete craziness when I saw that some of my colleagues and colleagues elsewhere on Twitter saying they want to use gaming platforms, and I thought, like, oh my God, how's this gonna work out? And then knowing people who had been doing work on alt-right organizing on gaming platforms, and knowing like this is really a troublesome.
It's dangerous.
Right. And also, like, what's the I mean, one could always say we're infiltrating those platforms. I guess there's like tactical media argument to be made. But okay, so let's go back to the term first. Context collapse. I believe it was actually from Dana Boyd when she was talking about social networks, right? And talking about the way in which all of a sudden, whereas in physical space, we might have some sort of distinction between different contexts, right? Like my neighborhood, my school, my work, my home, right? Which obviously doesn't hold for everyone. But let's assume, again, an ideal person who has these different contexts. What social media did was that all of a sudden it collapsed all of them into one, right? Like, and we noticed this I noticed this on Twitter. I've started it when I was, following uprisings in Turkey, and then now I'm, working at the university, and I have colleagues who are following me. I'm called Seda, the belly dancer. It's all. That's like a prime example of a context collapse, right? And many people think I'm a bot. That's kind of funny. So I think you already answered almost your question yourself, Sissel, when you said the mail system using it for art, right? And I think it's very interesting to think about deliberately collapsing context as a way of empowering a context that is otherwise maybe going to lose in power, right? And I think we can all kind of see the situation of the post offices. I guess in the Netherlands, things look kind of round and good still, but in many countries, the post offices look a little run down. It's a kind of underappreciated infrastructure. In the US, it's currently under complete questioning whether this infrastructure should exist. I think it maybe has something to do with elections and mail ballots that might be necessary. I'm sure others think that too. But it's also a moment where we are much more dependent on delivery for things to be delivered to us because of the COVID-19 lockdowns, and the fact that technology companies are deliberately positioning a lot of social and political issues as just a logistical problem, right? And I make this joke, right? Like Amazon delivers packages, Uber delivers people with cars to those who want to ride, Tinder delivers you lovers, right? So they basically take anything and turn it into a logistical problem, and the post is actually an infrastructure that is in competition with that thing. They kind of depend on it, but they have a desire to take it over and further optimize it. And it's not as easily optimized when it's a public service. So collapsing your artistic practice onto that is not just a coincidental thing, then it's also a kind of protection of an existing infrastructure or deliberate kind of strengthening of a existing infrastructure. And I think in that sense, you answered your own question as to, is there other ways of seeing this context collapse other than, my colleagues know that my first scholarship was because I was the interculturals fellow for my university, and therefore I belly danced a lot, which is why I'm a belly dancer on Twitter.
But I don't want to perpetuate a romanticist image of the arts, but I would say context collapse is something that's absolutely crucial to arts practice and also to the design practice. Otherwise, if it's not happening, then it means you're just producing within a system to reinforce that system. We have had enough of that, and especially if you, as an artist, as a designer, you want to have a practice that has an urgency, has a social urgency, then I think context collapses are one of the things that need to be part of your repertoire. Yeah? Oh God, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah.
But what is for you context collapse? Because if I think about it as a way of industry, especially startups, to disrupt existing forms of, let's say, societal structures to position themselves in the middle as power. That's a very different understanding of context collapse than what you're saying. So could you explain what you mean?
Yeah, for example, the situation that you described for the social media, that they suddenly created this kind of flat communicative space, and let's say also mixing up all the identities that people have. This is something that performance art has done, actually pioneered in the 1970s, right? So you could say, actually, if you look, to take really classical examples, if you look at pieces by Abramovich and Ulay from the 70s, they're almost all about context collapse. Yeah? In that sense, you could also say they could become co-opted. All these strategies have been co-opted then as business models for the so-called new economy. Everything that's been done in performance art, that's always the downside to it. I wouldn't even know how to escape that downside. So as I said, this dystopian side of what we are currently witnessing came suddenly to my mind when I talked to a colleague from another Dutch art school and a postgraduate institute, and she said, well, actually, most of our teachers don't live in the city. They don't even live in the country. They mostly live in Berlin. And what will likely happen is that even after the lockdown, the school will find ways that they can stay in Berlin. And this will completely change. And now try to scale this up to art schools worldwide. It means that maybe they will only have a small local faculty, and let's say buy the bigger names through the internet. So there will be maybe a kind of local proletariat, which is, yeah. Also at universities, that could happen. Huh? Like, let's say the writing tutor will be still maybe still, but even that, I'm not sure. But I mean, in art schools, we already have the hierarchy between the so-called workshop teachers and then the teachers of the actual design and art faculties. Huh? And then you just keep the workshop teachers on the ground, and everyone else is in Berlin and Skyping in. Yeah? And then there will also be a kind of race to, which school can buy which teachers, because of course you can switch your employer in no time. You're no longer dependent on these physical infrastructures, and that's the model of the two schools that I also mentioned in the in my presentation. That again could be an example of something that was actually started as an experimental and alternative practice, but could is extremely dangerous as something that could be grabbed and turned into a business model and turned into a kind of some new economy of art education. Yeah.
So I'm thinking if we want to think about possibly the university as a site for solidarity as well, as Seda was mentioning in her video, and we want to maintain the importance of material practice, of studio practice, but also, for instance, the importance of workshops or of the cleaning staff who are all making an art school as we know it, that we can continue to kind of push for, sorry, I just got a little notification, that we can kind of push as users of this space for the importance of continuing something that disrupts the possibility of somebody just sitting in Berlin and broadcasting out all of their knowledge, but continuing, for instance, to ask for ways around working with, for instance, workshop managers, or possibly that I'm imagining once possibly the lockdown starts to ease in a little bit, that there would be possibilities to ask to go into workshops or to look towards, for instance, an art initiative here in The Hague called III are renting out soldering stations for a really low price. So then there is actually a possibility of having different layers of practice and also of education that we can insist on still being really, really important to an art education. Do you agree with this? Well, I'm sure you do, but maybe you can elaborate on more ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be difficult, but I think we're going to have to give up on this idea that we can replicate what we had before in the online. And I think that's going to be the key thing, right? A lot of people finish their coursework by lecturing, making video recordings and putting it online, right? Whereas that neither does justice to the fact that class basically didn't take place anymore, and nor to the fact that we have different new material conditions, as Florian also said, under which we can learn and know, right? I think I talked about the fact that we don't know now by virtue of having lost our sensory capability, by being able to interact and encounter each other. And so the question is, how are we going to make up for this, is a question that cannot be answered just through more rectangles, right? And so I think, and this is why it's exciting, because if we can get the university to accept that replicating this institution, either through, not flying in your teachers from Berlin, but having them Zoom in or Skype in, and then eventually your budget runs dry from paying these licenses, and then you're left with nothing, right? Like, is to start thinking about what is this new institution that you are and you can become? What are ways not to let it be grinded down by this kind of service infrastructure that has become like a global movement to push people into this kind of script of all you need to do is put things online, and to start thinking about institutions that promote, as you said, solidarity. So solidarity with those who either keep the physical buildings. I hope we don't totally have to get rid of the physical buildings, although some of that licensing money is probably going to come from, currently not heating and not paying water and whatever cleaning staff. And eventually it's going to come from not having those buildings, maybe. But to think about, okay, what does it mean to let go of the space of the university, and what should be the space of the university? To think about notions of care. I think there was this really beautiful article, I will have to send a link to you afterwards, which said, a lot of governments are imagining control as the way to manage this situation with COVID-19. But we know from, for example, HIV/AIDS, that what helped the communities was to learn collective care, right? Like to, I don't know, wear condoms and things like this, right? Like just like now we're going to maybe have to wear masks, right? So what are structures of care that will allow our collaborations to take place, right? Like to start building those care structures, to think about sustainability. So if the budget of the university is going to be slashed, either because they put money into licenses now or because public funds are going to be cut in the future, this is the time to use the existing budget for a long-term project, right? Like, again, like to think about these things. And then I think for me, what's really most important is that COVID-19 made the injustices of our world so come into focus, right? Like we so know that if you're poor, immigrant, if you are, on the street, you're more likely to die right now. So how much more can we be clear on what is unjust, and how much can we continue building institutions that kind of look away from this injustice and produce things as if it doesn't exist? So the question is, what does it mean to build an arts institution or a university that looks this injustice in the eye and produces a new reality that actually addresses this somehow? I know I'm asking for a lot, but it's an opportunity.
It's the portal, as Arundhati was talking about. This there is a not going back to the old normal.
No.
I wanted to bring in, we actually had a question from our comment section from Alina, who asks, so when is the moment when teachers start refusing to participate rather than adapt on the spot to whatever conditions are given? And another question from Shan that I think also reinforces this is how much messiness can we cope with as teachers? So I think we have some teachers listening in who are probably at their limit to a certain extent. That's at least what I've heard from colleagues. Also emotionally, an exhaustion of care, maybe also of doing emotional labor. Is that something you can recognize from your own practice?
Yes, but I think it's a tightrope walk, right? I mean, yes. So people are overloaded with emotional labor at this point, and but it's the, let's say, a structurally comparable situation to, for example, what's happening in the healthcare sector, right? So I would also argue there's a certain duty that we have. It's and the responsibility. And I maybe I'm now saying something unpopular, but I also think that I also witness people taking this as an excuse. Not to take responsibility in this situation. And I think this is a fundamental crisis for the Netherlands. this year 2010 in the arts has been this kind of traumatic year, right? Well, I expect that what we're facing now, that 2010 was nothing against what's going to happen in the future. So I think it's
we're
about
already seeing it, right?
Well, we're already seeing it. Yes, yes, we're already seeing it, and it's not just about budget cuts. It's like I think it's a fundamental legitimacy crisis of the institutions, including all the art institutions. Because what we're seeing right now in the crisis is actually that these art institutions are expendable. Nobody's waiting for them. Nobody, there's a mismatch. There's a mismatch. They can be closed, and it doesn't create a public outcry. And let's say there's also a rush to do the streaming conferences and to do the streaming festivals in order to show I'm still alive, like on Kavara, and I deserve the money that I'm getting for my place. And if that is the only thing, if we are jumping to the systems only to show that we are still alive, to make this on Kavara performance, then I think things are fundamentally wrong. And indeed, everything that Seda has said about, for example, an ethics of care, a kind of reimagination of society, then needs to be done in order for this whole field not to become irrelevant.
I just saw a composer like a conductor from one of the large symphony houses in North Brabant that were protesting by sitting on a tractor outside of the Philharmonie or something like this, in order to make a point about which I thought was quite powerful in terms of thinking of like where are we assigning the importance in society. But I also have a hope that once people come out of the rectangles, that they're gonna crave a sense of materiality that you can only get from arts experiences or things like this. I have at least seen in Denmark, for instance, they're talking about, well, people go more out into green areas now, and especially really young people who usually got stuck behind the screens. So I think it's also, there's going to be sort of like a need for materiality. And I think that can also be a tool that we can explore either as artists or as arts institutions. But Seda, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I totally love what you say about the parks, right? And I think it's so interesting to see how full the parks are right now in Brussels. And, parks have always had their problems. They're also being policed and controlled right now. So I again see the kind of problems of power and poverty and race and gender in terms of who can be in which park when is there. But I totally think that the parks have become so important. And I really hope that a lot of you will pick up on the new public space that is being unfolded as we speak. I think there's a lot of work in terms of observing, engaging in ways that are, again, careful, caring, right? And I don't think we're just stuck with the rectangles. Now, the question is whether we will have institutions. That's a difficult one, I think, to support this practice, and how we can build infrastructures of support and care for this kind of practice to exist in this new world is an interesting one. With respect to the question of when do teachers stop participating rather than adapting, and how much messiness can we cope with? I think it's so important to show the vulnerability that we're in right now, and I think if the rectangles have done something, I mean, look, we're all in somewhat private spaces, and, we've seen children, we've seen cats, we've seen elderly, and I think in a sense, I feel like I know people more personally now in some weird way than before. And And I've seen many people saying, I need to go take care of my mom who have Alzheimer's, or things that I would never know about people that now come to the fore. People talking about new relationships they've established either with cohabitants, either children or other partners, or finding new partnerships. And I think it's really important that we do not keep the rectangles professional, right? Like it's so important to resist them, to make us look square in all senses of the word, right? Like, and not to let them square us, and to show that we're vulnerable and we don't know the future of our institutions. And we're doing this because we have a commitment to making sure that people still get their degrees and can go on their paths and learn, right? Like, but this is not as in being in solidarity with an economy which has been so destructive and which has so alienated our institutions to the point, as Florian says, is now like thinking of them as expandable, right? And I think in a sense, it's okay. We are messy. We have always been messy. If I would turn my camera around, you will see a lot of mess, right? Like, and let's stick. I think there is a possibility to actually let the mess come forth and to start sorting out. I actually think we're in an opportunity as we go forward, not to try to make the mess go away, but to confront it and see how we can come out stronger through that. I know it's exhausting and there's a lot of exhaustion, so I'm also very much in for people who want to take a break right now. So I understand that too.
But, Seda, I also see the risk there, namely that it becomes a kind of outsourcing, and that's an outsourcing also of responsibilities. Yeah.
Can you explain?
So yeah, I mean, it's let's say that we through doing this labor and through doing this transition, that basically institutional responsibilities get individualized.
Yes.
And yes. Yeah.
I agree.
But that's a problem also. That's a problem, because that means that people who do not have, let's say, the backing or the strength of an institution are fully exposed to it. And there's a discussion that we also had among teachers. I mean, I'm basically also channeling or quoting my colleague Catherine Somse, who had really concrete questions. Let's say, for example, if in the current situation where we basically, let's say, do remote homeschooling of students, and the students fails the exam, will I be individually liable? If the student sues? Because the institution has not been working and put all the teaching responsibility and the assessment responsibility on me. So let's say the whole kind of development that we already had in the last 20 years of kind of outsourcing and individualizing responsibility, making everyone a subcontractor, that could be the dark side, of that care scenario. So I think we need the institutions. That's also why I'm CISL side and would say, we need the kind of we need the gray areas between the institutional and the non-institutional. The non-institutional by itself is not a value.
I cannot agree more. I mean, I think my whole conversation was about the institutional perspective as being so important that if we only stick to, the rectangles, right? And if we don't look at what brings those rectangles to us and what it means for us to bring those rectangles to the students or to the staff or to the faculty, I totally agree with you. But I think that if people feel like they want to show their vulnerability at this moment, I think what I meant there is to take care of themselves and the situation by being honest to it. But I totally agree and will subscribe to anything that says we need the institutions, we're losing them, we need to fight for them, but we need to also be aware that they might not exist in the near future. So we need to ask the institutions to tell us how we're going to build sustainable structures when they're gone, right? Unfortunately, I don't know anything better right now. We can also act like they're not going to go away and then see what happens. But
No.
We're almost at the end. I wanted to just pull in one last question that I think builds on this, which is from Jonathan. So is Seda and Florian suggesting that institutions in some sense be remodeled more like infrastructures? And how can these institutions be transversal and transformative?
If I had the answer. You know, I think it's almost like the question to the epidemiologist or virologist, you know, what is the cure for COVID? You know, it's like, and then you have to say, no, I don't know. We don't know a lot yet. And I don't even want to pretend that I know. I know that's unsatisfying, and I'm not happy. I'm dissatisfied with myself of giving such a kind of bouncing answer. But I think this is the collective effort that we are facing, and it's an open question. I'm not sure, Seda, how you see it. Do you have an answer?
Oh God, I don't. But I mean, it's a discussion I've been having with Martha Poon, who is my collaborator on the political economy of computational infrastructures, and she made me read a piece about the history of the Canal du Midi in France, and it's written by Chandra Mukherjee, and it's about infrastructural power. And in a sense, since the 17th century, it seems that what we're seeing is that infrastructure becomes a way to subvert existing let's say, power that's based on the discursive, right? In a sense, the rationality, the enlightenment, right? Like we can read, we can know, we can make statements, and we can change, right? Where now you can actually introduce infrastructures and start making changes in society and using that to establish power. So in that sense, if we see institutions as an infrastructure, then they are potentially a counterpower. And that's why I think it's very important to defend them, but to be aware that institutional power like that and infrastructural power, on the one hand, is empowered by the individuals that make it, but it also orders the individuals into those who are inside and who are outside and who have the power to speak and who don't. And I think what we're seeing is if the institution as our infrastructure is being transformed right now, and who is going to get power and how do we ensure that the right people get power is going to be the exciting question, I think, to go along with that.
One last comment that we're just getting at the end of it is from, well, weird weird username. So materiality other than that on the screen is so important now, and that moves the center or the brunt of this work off the institutions to the local communities. And I think with that, I wanted to just show you guys the front page of Metropolis M, which is the museum in a hat by Martin Laroche, which I think is in Brussels. And I was just reading about this earlier, how he is having this project of going around with the museum. So this is a museum hall, and he has different museum halls that he's bringing out, and each hall has a story. And I think that there is a lot of potential there, both institutionally and non-institutionally. And I really enjoyed all of the examples that Florian brought in. John and I are also bringing it into our teaching practice. I'm making these little kits for students to send out, where we're making masks with everything is sewn together with the little beard sensor, and everything needs to be, because we have no soldering iron. So you really have to rethink, well, how do we engage students with materials, but at a distance? So you're really kind of forced to think in completely different ways. So I think, ending with materiality and in a way the public that you're creating, even if it's a public that's as small as can fit in a hat, is also kind of worth thinking about and maybe ending with. Would you like to respond finally to the last comment that we had? Either of you. Otherwise, I will wrap this up because we're
No, I think that's one of the things that I also see art initiatives doing here in Rotterdam. For example, making mask sewing workshops. And that again, it's kind of weird, we have these textile workspaces in our art schools. We could actually produce masks. Why are we not doing that? It's like why are we sitting behind these conference systems? Yep. Or we think our art education. What do you have at home? What are the things at hand with which you can do something? And you could even still do teleconferencing, but indeed as a material practices. So again, these two things don't need to be binary, black and white, the one or the other. But think of, for example, a mask making workshop that is coordinated through teleconferencing, but everyone works with the available materials. And if it's toilet paper, which people are no longer hoarding, but yeah.
Just 2 seconds too late. That was great. I guess one of the things I'm really thinking about for the next couple of years, and this has a little bit to do, can you hear me? This has a lot to do actually with my personal situation, which is that my parents are above 65, and the government in Turkey has decided that the lockdown specifically applies to, they're not allowed to go on the streets, right? And this Sunday, they had 4 hours of relief from lockdown only for 65 plus. So I would have loved to have been in Istanbul to see the streets full of people who are 65 plus. And of course, there were articles that they were standing too close and not, abiding by the 1.5 meter things, etc. But I do think that the new public that is coming to being has a different vector of organizing through vulnerability, right? And I think some people are not going to be able to go out. Some people are not going to be able to get close. And some people are not going to be able to hang out with, let's say, children, right? And it's really painful for me to think of this new sociality that is going to be with us at least for a little while. And so I think for me, that's very material. It's like the material condition of our social, which is defined through a vector of a virus, which feels so immaterial, but yet it's so going to be material, right? And I would love to see people find ways for us to touch and see and care and love and be together. That is not these rectangles. But is very aware of this spectrum of vulnerability. So to think about the public, not just in terms of space, because not everybody will be able to occupy that space, but to expand that space to include these different parties. I think that would be like something I would love to see, really out of a very personal interest in this case. But I think that I'm trustful that people in Artes, but also in other institutions, will come up with these practices of togetherness and new publics that is aware of vulnerabilities. I think I would love to see that.
I think that's a really beautiful proposition to end this on. Open desire and question for anybody listening at Artes or beyond. I will definitely take it to heart. And I want to thank both of you so much for participating today. And also, of course, everyone who have taken part in the discussion or been listening to us talking. I also want to just mention that our next module of videos will go live on the 21st of May. And the next live event summarizing and synthesizing the 4 videos that we will be releasing will take place on the 26th of May at 1:00 p.m. CEST. So please don't miss that. We will update our website that you can find in the comments, as well as our Facebook group with these dates. And this module will feature a group of artists and researchers, designers and organizers that are going to give us their best hacks and tools for connecting and creating through remote media. So I think it will tie very beautifully together with our conversation today. And we hope to see you all there. And please also follow the link in the description to our landing page on Artes' website, where you can find instructions on how to sign up if you would like to be part of putting together this kind of toolkit for critical education in the near future. So thank you, everybody, and hope to see you on the 26th.
And thanks to Sissel and John for all their great work, and Nishan for having us. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Live stream out.